I always thought I had one of those lives people envied, a solid, unshakable kind of life. The kind you see in commercials, retirement plans, a house paid off, a wife who still held my hand in the grocery store. On paper, it was perfect. Every morning I woke up at 6:15 without an alarm. The bed was warm, Linda's side neatly made after she got up earlier, the scent of her lotion lingering in the air. I'd shuffle to the kitchen, pour coffee into the same chipped mug I'd used for a decade, and stand at the window watching the neighborhood stir to life. The Johnsons' golden retriever barking at the mailman, old Mr. Riley next door stubborn as ever, raking leaves he didn't need to rake. I'd been at the same engineering firm for 28 years. Retired now, but they still called me sometimes. Just to pick your brain, Mark. Linda joked it was because no one else remembered how the old systems worked. She was probably right. Our kids were grown, settled. A grandson in Ohio who called me Papa over video chats. Holidays were full, noisy, the way they're supposed to be. Everyone said we were lucky, and I knew we were. But there were moments, small, quiet ones, when I'd catch myself staring at nothing, standing in the garage too long, listening to the hum of the freezer, sitting on the edge of the bed at night, my fingers tracing the frayed edge of the quilt Linda's mother made us, wondering how so many years had passed without me noticing. Linda still kissed me goodbye when she left for her book club, still laughed at my dumb jokes. But sometimes, when she thought I wasn't looking, I'd see her face go still, like she was listening to something far away. I never asked what it was. Maybe I didn't want to know. Then, one Tuesday in October, Diane called. Linda's best friend since college, the one who always hugged me a little too long, who knew our secrets before we did. "Meet me for a drink, Mark. There's something you need to hear." Her voice was low, urgent. Not the Diane I knew. I almost said no, almost made an excuse about helping a neighbor with his lawnmower, but something in her silence, the way it filled the space between us, made my stomach tighten. So I went. And that's when the cracks in my perfect life started to split wide open. I sat in my truck for 10 minutes after Diane left the bar, hands gripping the wheel like it might steady me. The neon open sign buzzed overhead, casting a sickly red glow on the dashboard. My coffee from that morning sat cold in my stomach, now churning with something bitter. I drove home the long way, past the old elementary school where Linda and I used to take the kids for ice cream after parent-teacher conferences. The building looked smaller now, the playground equipment replaced with bright plastic structures that didn't squeak in the wind like the metal ones used to. Funny how you don't notice things changing until they're already different. The house was dark when I pulled in, just the porch light left on for me, Linda's habit, even after 30 years. I could see her shadow moving behind the kitchen blinds, the blue glow of the TV flickering in the living room. Normal. Everything looked normal. I stood in the garage for a while, running my thumb over the smooth handle of Linda's gardening shears. She'd been pruning the roses that afternoon. I could smell the green cut stem scent on the air. Her phone was charging on the workbench, screen lit up with a notification. I told myself I wouldn't look. But then I saw the name, Rob. Just that. No last name, no context. A text preview too short to make out. My chest went tight. Rob had been Linda's college boyfriend, the one she almost married before we met, the one she never talked about. I'd only heard stories from Diane years ago, back when we all still drank too much at summer barbecues and laughed about the past. I picked up the phone, put it down, picked it up again. The screen went dark. Upstairs, the shower turned on. Linda always showered at night, a ritual she'd kept since the kids were babies. I could hear the water running, the pipes groaning in the walls. A familiar sound, a safe sound. I opened the fridge, stared at the leftovers wrapped in foil, the half-empty bottle of Chardonnay. Our life, neatly packed away. Then I saw it, the little yellow sticky note stuck to the milk carton. Aurora, Thursday, 11 a.m. No explanation. Just a time, an initial in Linda's looping handwriting. I peeled it off, held it between my fingers. The paper was so light, insignificant, but it felt like holding a lit match. The shower shut off. Footsteps padded down the hall. I crumpled the note in my palm, shoved it in my pocket. When Linda came into the kitchen, her hair damp, her robe tied tight, she smiled at me like nothing was wrong. "You're home late," she said. I nodded. Took a beer from the fridge, acted like my heart wasn't hammering against my ribs. Thursday, 11 a.m., 2 days from now. I had time to decide, to ask, to fight, to pretend I hadn't seen anything at all. But for the first time in years, I didn't know which version of the truth I wanted. Thursday morning arrived like an uninvited guest. I woke before dawn, the digital clock casting a sickly green glow across the bedroom. 4:37 a.m. Linda slept peacefully beside me, one hand curled under her chin like a child's. I studied the familiar lines of her face, the soft creases at her eyes, the way her lips parted slightly with each breath. How many mornings had I woken to this same sight? 1,000? More? I dressed in the dark, my hands moving automatically through the ritual. Khakis, button-down, the leather belt our son gave me for Father's Day 3 years ago. The house was tomb quiet as I moved through it, each creak of the floorboard sounding like an accusation. In the garage, I hesitated. The gardening shears still lay where Linda had left them, blades flecked with dried rose sap. I picked them up, ran my thumb along the edge. Sharp, well cared for, like everything in our life. The sticky note burned in my wallet where I'd hidden it. R. Thursday, 11 a.m. Coffee tasted like ash. I poured it down the sink and drove to the diner instead, the one where Linda and I used to go after Sunday Mass when the kids were small. The vinyl booth stuck to my thighs as I slid in. 10:45 a.m. I ordered black coffee and a slice of cherry pie I knew I wouldn't eat. The waitress, Marge, her name tag said, smiled at me with the tired kindness of someone who'd served 1,000 broken men like me. The bell above the door jingled at 10:58. I didn't turn around, just watched the reflection in the chrome napkin dispenser as Linda walked in, her sundress swirling around calves still tan from summer. She paused at the hostess stand, scanning the room. Then I saw him. Rob looked older than in the college photos I'd seen. Thinning hair gone fully gray, shoulders slightly stooped. But I'd have known him anywhere by the way Linda's face changed when she saw him. A light I hadn't seen in years. They took a booth in the back. I watched through the reflection as he reached across the table to cover her hand with his, watched as she didn't pull away. My coffee cooled. The ice in my water glass melted. At some point, Marge refilled my cup without asking. "You all right, hun?" I nodded, lied. When I finally turned to leave, I caught Linda's eye across the diner. The color drained from her face. Rob followed her gaze, his expression shifting from confusion to something like pity. I walked out into the blinding noon sun, the bell jingling behind me like laughter. Halfway to the truck, my phone buzzed, a text from Linda. "Mark, please let me explain." I stood there in the parking lot, keys digging into my palm, staring at those 3 words, 30 years of marriage, 3 words. And suddenly, I wasn't sure I wanted to hear any of them. I drove for hours without direction, the truck's AC blasting against the late summer heat, while my hands stayed numb on the wheel. The text notification glowed on my dashboard, unanswered, like an open wound. I passed the high school where Linda and I first met at a football game, the park where I'd taught our daughter to ride a bike, the intersection where we'd kissed at a red light like teenagers. Every landmark felt like a museum exhibit of a life I wasn't sure belonged to me anymore. At dusk, I found myself parked outside Diane's house. The porch light was off, but through the living room curtains, I could see the blue flicker of a television. I almost knocked, almost asked the woman who'd started this avalanche to help me dig through the wreckage. Instead, I pressed my forehead against the steering wheel and breathed in the stale coffee and leather smell of my truck until my pulse slowed. When I finally came home, the house smelled like lavender and lemon cleaner. Linda's purse sat neatly on the entryway bench, her gardening shoes lined up beneath it like always. Upstairs, I could hear the shower running, that same evening ritual, as if today were any other day. I stood in our bedroom doorway watching steam curl from beneath the bathroom door. Her phone buzzed on the nightstand. I told myself not to look, told myself I'd seen enough. But there it was again, that name. Rob. This time the message was visible. I'm so sorry about today. Please call me when you can. The shower cut off. I set the phone down exactly as I'd found it, my fingers trembling like they'd touched something radioactive. Linda emerged wrapped in her terry cloth robe, her hair dripping onto the carpet we'd picked out together at Home Depot 15 years ago. She froze when she saw me, one hand flying to her throat. Mark, she whispered. Just my name. But it sounded like a confession. I wanted to scream, wanted to demand answers. Instead, I stared at the framed photo on her dresser, us at our son's wedding last spring, her head resting on my shoulder, my arm tight around her waist. Two people who looked like they knew how to love each other. Was it just today? My voice surprised me. Calm, almost detached. Or has there been more? A droplet of water slid down Linda's temple like a tear. The house creaked around us the way old houses do when they're holding their breath. Outside, a car door slammed. Laughter floated in through the open window. Our neighbors arriving home from some ordinary evening out. A life where no one had to ask these questions. Linda opened her mouth, closed it. And in that silence, I heard everything I needed to know. I woke to an empty bed, the sheets on Linda's side cold and taut, like they'd never been slept in. Dawn painted the room in pale gray light, revealing the dust motes floating above her untouched pillow. The house held that particular quiet of a home where two people are carefully not speaking to each other. Downstairs, I found Linda at the kitchen table, her hands wrapped around a mug of tea gone cold. She looked up when I entered, her eyes red-rimmed but dry. We'd been married long enough to know some hurts run too deep for tears. I was going through old boxes, she said finally, nodding to the basement stairs. Her voice sounded scraped raw. Thought you might want these. On the table sat a manila envelope, slightly yellowed at the edges. Inside were letters, dozens of them, all in my handwriting, dated during my 6-month contract job in Texas back in '98. The summer our daughter turned 4. The summer I'd missed her first bike ride, first lost tooth, first everything. I lifted one at random, the paper brittle under my fingers. I miss the way you hum off key when you do the dishes, I'd written. Tell Sarah Daddy's counting the days until he can read her goodnight moon again. Linda's fingers trembled as she reached for another envelope. You wrote me every Tuesday and Friday like clockwork, even when you were exhausted, even when... Her breath hitched. Even when I sometimes took weeks to write back. I remembered those months away. The lonely motel rooms, the payphone calls where Sarah's voice sounded tinny and far away. How Linda had always seemed distracted when we talked. How our conversations grew shorter each week. At the time, I'd chalked it up to her being overwhelmed, parenting alone. Now I noticed the postmarks on her replies. Always late, sometimes by weeks. A Polaroid slid from the stack. A younger Linda at some backyard barbecue, smiling up at the camera while a familiar hand rested on her shoulder. Rob's hand, the same gold college ring he'd been wearing at the diner. The microwave clock beeped 7 a.m., the sound absurdly loud in the heavy silence. Outside, sprinklers hissed to life up and down the street, a normal Tuesday morning in a normal neighborhood. Linda touched the edge of the photo. It wasn't, she swallowed. It wasn't what you think, but standing there holding evidence of my own devotion from 25 years ago, I realized the more painful question wasn't about what had happened back then. It was why she'd kept these letters all these years. It was why she'd chosen today to show them to me, and whether any amount of history could outweigh what I'd seen with my own eyes 2 days ago. The coffee maker gurgled, finishing its cycle. Linda stood to pour 2 cups out of habit, one black, one with cream, before catching herself. She set mine down carefully, like an offering at an altar. I stared at the steam rising between us, realizing with a dull ache that some secrets aren't kept in darkness. They're hidden in plain sight, waiting for you to recognize them for what they are. I spent that night in the guest room for the first time in 32 years of marriage. The sheets smelled faintly of mothballs and the lavender sachets Linda insisted on keeping in every closet. Through the wall, I could hear her moving about our bedroom, the creak of the mattress, the soft click of her reading light turning off. Familiar sounds that now felt like echoes from someone else's life. At 3:17 a.m., I gave up on sleep and went downstairs. The house was so still I could hear the refrigerator humming in the kitchen. Moonlight spilled across the dining room table where the letters still lay scattered, casting long shadows that made the envelopes look like unmarked graves. I picked up the Polaroid again. The Linda in the photo was younger, her smile easier, her hair streaked with summer sunlight. Rob's hand on her shoulder wasn't possessive, just casual, comfortable. The kind of touch that suggested history. The kind I hadn't thought about in decades. In the junk drawer, I found the magnifying glass we used for reading fine print. Under its lens, details emerged. The corner of a picnic table stacked with beer bottles, the edge of a banner that read Class of '89 Reunion, and on Linda's left hand, no wedding ring. Just the thin tan line where it should have been, the summer I was in Texas, the summer she'd taken so long to reply to my letters. Upstairs, a floorboard groaned. I slipped the photo into my pocket just as Linda appeared in the doorway, her robe cinched tight around her waist. She looked older in the blue dark kitchen, the lines around her eyes deeper than they'd been in the afternoon. "You should come back to bed," she said softly. I wanted to ask about the reunion, about the missing ring, about whether she'd ever really stopped loving him, but the words stuck in my throat like burrs. Instead, I reached for the stack of letters and slid one across the table to her, the one I'd written on our 10th anniversary, when we were still young enough to believe love was simple. She unfolded it carefully, her fingers tracing the faded ink. When she looked up, her eyes were wet. "I kept these because they were the best parts of us," she whispered. The clock above the stove ticked loudly in the silence. Somewhere outside, an owl called. I thought about all the years between that letter and this moment, the Christmases, the hospital rooms, the ordinary Tuesday nights, the life we'd built together despite everything. And for the first time since the diner, I let myself wonder, was it enough? The morning came softly, pale light creeping through the blinds like an apology. I sat at the kitchen table, turning the Polaroid over in my hands while the coffee pot gurgled, the same cheap drip machine we'd had since the kids were in high school. Linda had always talked about replacing it, but I liked the way it hissed and sputtered, a familiar soundtrack to our mornings. She entered barefoot, her robe hanging loose. For a long moment, we just looked at each other across the table, the photo between us like a lit fuse. "Tell me the truth," I said finally. Not demanding, not angry, just tired. The kind of tired that settles into your bones after carrying something too heavy for too long. Linda's fingers trembled as she reached for the picture. "It was just that one summer," she whispered, "when you were in Texas, when I was so lonely I could barely breathe." The admission hung in the air between us. I thought of all the times I'd called from payphones, how her voice had sounded distant even then, how I'd blamed myself for leaving, for not being enough. She slid a folded piece of paper across the table, a letter I hadn't seen before, the edges frayed from years of handling. "I wrote this to you after it ended. Never sent it. Mark," it began, "I don't know how to tell you what I've done." Her handwriting was shaky, the ink smudged in places where tears had fallen. The words spilled out, guilt, shame, the desperate ache of a woman who'd lost herself in the loneliness of parenting, who'd reached for a ghost of her younger self just to feel alive again. "I chose you." The letter ended. "Every day since, I've chosen you." Outside, a lawnmower started up down the street, the ordinary sound of an ordinary Saturday. I studied my wife, really studied her, for the first time in years. The silver threading through her hair, the laugh lines deepened by decades of joy and pain, the way her hands still fidgeted when she was nervous, just like they had when we were 20. "Why keep the photo?" I asked. She met my gaze, her eyes raw but steady. "To remember what it cost." The coffee maker beeped. The sun climbed higher. And in that quiet kitchen, with our shared history spread out between us, I realized the deepest betrayals aren't always the ones we inflict on each other, but the lies we tell ourselves. That love is perfect, that marriage is safe, that trust, once broken, can't become something new. Linda reached for my hand. I let her take it. Her palm was warm, familiar. Not the hand of the girl in the photo, but the woman who'd grown old with me. The one who'd stayed. Maybe that was the only truth that mattered. Or maybe it was just the one I could live with.